So let's welcome Henry, Eliot and Monabi Mitra with a big round of applause. They're here to shed their part of light on 10 in classics that the world is reading today and why. Yes, and we should be reading too.
Thank you.
Welcome to this wonderful literary festival, which clearly shows that reading is one of the joys of life. The fact that everybody is here and we are celebrating literature from the whole day through. This session deals with the classics, the kind of classics that India reads today, might have read in the past, or might like to read, and the kind of classics that epitomize all literature, as it were. When I use the word classics, I use it in the sense of works of literature which, because of their excellence and significance, are as alive today as they were when they were first written. And of course, classics, the underlying assumption behind all classics is that they present a universality of emotions. They are not time-bound. They stand outside time almost. And there's so many emotions which can be gathered from the reading of a classic. Self-discovery and other timeless emotions like love and friendship, struggle, endurance, the whole gamut of emotions that humans feel. We are very privileged to have with us today Henry Eliot, who is the creative editor of Penguin Classics UK, and what better person to introduce the world of classics to us than Henry. A word before I give him the mic. He is a writer as well, with 3 books, the first being A Guide to London called Curiosity, the second being A History of Mazes and Labyrinths and How They Have Been Built called Follow This Thread, and the third is a book directly about the Penguin Classics, Penguin Classics.
What's the first one?
The first one is called Curiosity. All 3 of the books have been inspired by his love of the classics and literature. And Henry also organized literary tours, like tours of the Lake District and a tour recreating Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I wish I had been there for that one. So without further ado, let's welcome Henry Eliot.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Monabi. That was a lovely introduction, and it's lovely to see so many people here. Thank you for having me here at the Tollygunge Club. It's a real pleasure to be here. I should start just by saying that I think this talk was advertised with the title 10 Books that Indians Should Read. Now that, I have to tell you, was not my own title, and I just want to say that I don't feel I'm in a position really to tell Indians what they should read. So what I'm going to talk about today, if it's alright, is 10 books which I think everyone could read, and maybe you should if you want to take my word for it. So yes, my name's Henry Eliot. My latest book is this book here, which is a kind of reader's companion to the Penguin Classics series. It's partly a history of that series, which has been going for over 70 years, and it's partly a kind of tour through the whole history of world literature. So I'm not going to try and summarise the whole of world literature in the next 45 minutes, but my plan is to go through a kind of quick whistle-stop tour of some of the highlights of this book, and I am going to recommend some titles, and I'm sure it'll be a bit controversial and you'll disagree with some of them. And what I'd love is, while I'm talking, if you could come up with some really great questions, then in the last 15 minutes, Monabi and I will have a conversation together and with you, and I'm particularly looking forward to that bit. So just briefly, I suspect we all have at least heard of the Penguin Classics. Let me just quickly introduce that series. It began over 70 years ago, as I said, in 1946, when a semi-retired academic publisher called E.V. Rue was sitting on top of a roof during the night in the 1940s. And he was sitting on top of the roof of Birkbeck College, a university in London. He was watching out for fires during the Blitz, during German bombardment of London. He was looking out for any fires that would break out, and then he'd alert the authorities. And he would pass the time by translating Homer's Odyssey. And he said he went back to Homer in these unreal times because Homer was the supreme realist. And he felt like by translating Homer, he was kind of holding on, grounding himself in these strange, strange times. And so he finished this translation during the war, and every evening he was reading it out to his wife. And maybe after a few years of this, she was getting a bit fed up, I suspect. And she said, look, why don't you try and publish this translation? Why don't you send it to Penguin Books, which was quite a young publishing company. It had only been going for about 10 years at the time. And so Evie Roos sent this manuscript to Penguin, and frankly, it wasn't a very promising prospect, because between the wars, between the First and Second War, there had been 8 new editions of the Odyssey published in Britain. And only 3 of them were new translations, and only three of them had made more than 3,000 sales. Most of them hadn't sold very well at all. So this wasn't a very promising thing. But Alan Lane, the founder of Penguin Books, loved this translation. He took a gamble and he commissioned it, and he not only commissioned this translation, he commissioned the translator, Evie Roos, to be the series editor of a new Penguin series called Penguin Classics. And it was a brilliant gamble, because this book, this translation of the Odyssey, was the best-selling Penguin book for years. It sold over 3 million copies, and it was the first book which overtook it, published by Penguin, was Lady Chatterley's Lover, when that became so notorious after the famous trial. So it was a very clever piece of publishing, and it, of course, started what has become a very well-loved list of classic publishing. 70 years later, we now have over 2,000 titles on this list, and we have, it's gone through 4 different cover designs. It covers languages, it covers something like 20, or maybe even more, something like 30 different languages. It's a very broad, very rich, and the largest series of classics published in the world. So it's a great privilege for me to work on this list. It's, it feels, I mean, it is a dream job, and I feel very lucky to have it. And I feel very lucky to be here to talk to you. Now, what I thought I'd do, I mean, it's a crazy task to try and recommend 10 classics out of 2,000 or whatever. But what I thought I'd do is just kind of sweep through the history of literature and pick out a few highlights to recommend. So I think it's worth remembering that at the very beginning of literature, spoken language had been around for much, much longer than written language. And perhaps the most significant moment in the history of literature was a moment sometime in the 36th century BC, when some genius took a reed, folded it in half to make a kind of triangular wedge shape, and pressed it into a piece of wet clay. And this is the very earliest form of writing that we know of. What they would do initially was press this wedge-shaped reed into wet clay, which they would then bake in the sun, and it would last for a long time. And initially it was very simple. It was a simple form of tally, so you might count how many sheep you sold that day, and you'd make 4 marks. And it became a little bit more sophisticated. It became almost like a form of hieroglyphics, where this symbol meant that sheep or that feeling. And then sometime in the 27th century BC, a really crucial change happened. And this form of writing, this wedge-shaped writing, which is known now as cuneiform writing, which simply means wedge-shaped, cuneiform script was suddenly used for the first time to record spoken language. It was no longer just a tally system, it actually recorded the complexities of human speech. And the first language to be recorded in script was the Sumerian language in southern Mesopotamia. And quickly, other neighboring languages like Hittite, a number of different languages, took this tool, and suddenly writing appeared, written language appeared. And before long, so did written literature. Now, it's interesting that the first works of literature in many different languages are what we now describe as epics, these epic works. And I think that must be because they are the inheritors of this oral tradition which existed before the written language. There was this very complex, interconnected sort of web of stories which a community would tell to each other to tell each other who they were. And so when writing appeared, that was one of the first stories that got written down. So the examples are all over the place. The earliest work of literature we know about is a Mesopotamian epic called the Epic of Gilgamesh. which is about a great king, Gilgamesh, who goes on various adventures. He fights a great bull from the sky, he seeks immortality, and he also grapples with a huge monster called Humbaba. In Europe, there's the sort of founding epics of European literature are Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. But for my first recommendation of the 10 books, I'm going to, since we're here, I'm going to suggest the Ramayana would be an excellent place to start. It's, of course, one of the oldest epic works of literature in the world. It's written in Sanskrit, which is a fascinating language because it's one of the very earliest Indo-European languages that is still used commonly today. And, well, as you know much better than me, it is still extremely culturally relevant across India, and not just across India, across many parts of Asia. These stories and these characters, these cultural reference points are used in conversation in the media, and I think, as Monabi was saying, that is a real sign of a classic when it's still alive and it's still being used. So recommendation number 1 is the Ramayana. So what happened next? There are a number of different forms that emerged alongside the epic. One, which is very long enduring, is the form of lyric poetry, short poetry which is supposed to be heard. Many others appeared, such as philosophy, drama, history, letters and speeches and so on. And my feeling is that a lot of these early works of literature, the purpose of them was to cohere a community. It was to, for a community to look back at itself and tell itself who it was and what it believed in, and to help it connect as a community. And I have this theory about literature, great works of literature, that on the whole they appear in reaction to whatever the status quo is. They're an attempt to do something new, to say something fresh. And so often a great work of literature will be the herald of a great sort of cultural shift in some way. And so I think these early works are kind of cohering communities. And then if we move forward several centuries into what we now call the Middle Ages, the sort of age between the ancient world and the more modern world, I think many works of literature were almost trying to challenge that idea of a cohesive community at odds to all the other cohesive communities around. I think these works of medieval literature were trying to show two things. They were trying to show that actually there's a lot of diversity among humans. Human species, there's lots that unites us, but there's also a lot that makes us different and distinct and rich and wonderful in that. And at the same time, I think these books are almost doing the opposite thing. They're saying you've got all these different communities which are sort of antagonistic towards each other. And some of these medieval works are actually saying, no, look, hold on, there are some globe-wide universalities which connect us as humans. And so I was trying to think what to use as an example here. I could have used the Tales of the 1001 Nights, which came out of Arabia, or even the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer, which I think is one of my favourite works, and it's certainly a great celebration of different types of people. But the book I've gone for is what some people describe as the very earliest novel. It's the absolutely extraordinary Tale of Genji, a Japanese novel from 1021 by the female author Murasaki Shikibu. And this came out of a period of Japanese literature where most of the literature was produced in these very sort of elite court environments, where mostly female writers would be noticed for their skill in writing, and then they would be attached to one of the royal imperial courts around Japan. They would produce literature, and often these writers were in kind of direct competition with each other and would respond to each other. But this book, The Tale of Genji, it's an absolute kind of towering pillar in Japanese literature, and it's the tale of a great prince, a shining prince called Genji, who for kind of unclear reasons is sort of demoted from his position by his father, the emperor, to become a mere commoner. And then the story is one of all his various love affairs and intrigues, and as he slowly kind of grows back, gets back his fortune and his social status. But along the way he meets all kinds of people, all different ranks of society, a bit like in the Canterbury Tales. And I think this is Murasaki Shikibu doing exactly the thing I was describing, of showing how both society is very different and rich for that, but also there are universal traits which make us human, which means we should, try and make love, not war. Then, hope this won't become too sort of list-like, do stop me if it does. But then, after these sort of Middle Ages, again, I think there was a reaction. There was this sense that we were all kind of similar. And then I think this event happened really across the world, which has come to be known as the Renaissance, the rebirth of culture and literature. And in the West, in Europe, this took the form of what's now called humanism, where the human became, sort of mankind, humankind became the centre of intellectual activity. And, you know, again, I could have chosen lots of examples to illustrate this. A great one would, of course, be Hamlet by Shakespeare, where it's incredible. This single character is so inward-looking. He's kind of trying to work out who he is, how he relates to his family, to his duty, to his education, to the state. And it's a wonderful work. I could have chosen that. Another thing I could have chosen are the essays of Michel de Montaigne, the French writer, who really invented the essay form. And what he said of his essays was that he was going to simply reproduce what was inside himself. So instead of looking outside and to other people or other cultures for his material, he simply looked inside himself and described what he thought and what he could see. But what I'm going to go for instead is really, I think, the greatest work of the very beginning of the Renaissance, and that is the Divine Comedy by Dante. This huge, sprawling, but exquisitely structured series of 3 great poems by the Florentine poet Dante. And I think this is such an interesting work because it really is on the cusp between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Because for those who don't know, it's the story of the narrator, who is kind of a figure of Dante, who says he's lost. He says, midway upon the journey of his life, I lost my way. And it's a kind of metaphor for, I think, for all of us when we get to that moment where we're kind of, you know, we've grown out of childhood, we've reached adulthood, and now what do I do with my life? And he meets in this forest that he's got lost in, he meets Virgil, the great epic Roman poet who wrote the Aeneid. And Virgil leads him down on this sort of journey through the medieval worldview. They descend through hell into the centre of the earth, down the 9 circles of hell. They meet all these famous characters from the past who are locked there. They finally reach the devil at the very centre of the earth, and who's locked in a kind of sea of ice. And they crawl down the leg hairs on his massive legs. And then a very strange thing happens at the very centre of the earth, because they're sort of climbing down these leg hairs, and they get to the centre of the earth. They turn around and start climbing the opposite direction. And Dante thinks, what are we doing? We're just climbing back into hell. But because something weird has happened at the centre of the earth, in fact, they're carrying on through the earth, and they emerge on the other side. They climb Mount Purgatory, which reaches right up into space. And then in the third part, Paradise, they head off into space, into this sort of medieval view of what space is like, and meet eventually God at the end of this journey. So it's this extraordinary vision of the medieval worldview, but told at the very beginning of the Renaissance by this great proto-humanist. Because, of course, at the centre of this story is this figure of a man, this one man who journeys through, who's an outsider looking at this world. And it's all about what this journey does to him as a person, how he reacts to these different circles. And so I think, you know, it's said to be the greatest work of the Middle Ages, the Divine Comedy, and I think that would certainly be on my list. In the East, the same Renaissance was going on, but it was going on in a slightly different way. So Renaissance means rebirth, and it was to do with the kind of recovery of old texts. So Dante was recovering Virgil to help him through this. Many of the writers of this period in the West were rediscovering Greek and Latin classical authors. In the East, there was a different kind of rediscovery going on, and it was much more of a spiritual Renaissance. There's a great effusion of spiritual classics which come out at this time, mystical classics and religious texts. And again, there's lots of sort of choice here. I was thinking of including the poems of Rumi, the great Persian poet and mystic. There are many European mystics, in fact, who are part of this tradition, and I did think about including one of the Tibetan Buddhist texts, because around this period there was this theory of the terma, the Buddhist terma, which were these straight, it's quite a sort of odd concept, but it was this idea that there are these texts hidden in the world, and some of them are hidden on mountains, and in lakes, and some of them in the air, and some of them in your mind. And the job of a Buddhist writer at this time was to uncover these terma and reveal them for everyone else. And there was, I forget the word, but there was a word for the people who sought these terma and revealed them. And one of them, of course, is what's now known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. That's one of the most famous of these terma. But anyway, I thought to represent this kind of spiritual renaissance, I choose perhaps the greatest of the Chinese novels, which has got various different titles in English, but it's often known as The Journey to the West by Wu Cheng-en, or even more commonly, and this is how we publish it in Penguin Classics, as Monkey. Now, Monkey is this fantastic adventure story, really. It's about a Chinese Buddhist monk who travels to the west. He travels to the mountains of India to obtain these Buddhist scriptures that he desires, he seeks. Again, it's about kind of going on a journey, a bit like Dante, to recover this spiritual understanding. And along the way, he's assisted by three kind of amusing friends. He's got a pig who's his friend, he's got a water buffalo, and he's got a very kind of naughty monkey friend, who's in a way the most charismatic character in this book, and that's often why it's called Monkey. So they go on this quest, and they meet all sorts of bandits and monsters and dragons and all kinds of terrifying things. So they sort of go through all these different have to leap all these hurdles to get these scriptures. And finally they reach Vulture Peak in northern India, this mystical mountain, and finally the Buddha reveals to them these scriptures that they have been looking for. And you realize that all these kind of trials, these very kind of humorous and exciting trials that they've been going through, are in fact tests of their faith and of their endurance and of their persistence. And when they finally achieved all these goals, these scriptures are revealed. So I highly recommend Monkey. That was number 4. Then, in the 17th century, so Monkey was written in 1592, so exactly the same time that Shakespeare was writing Romeo and Juliet, for instance. He hadn't yet written Hamlet when Monkey was written. In the 17th century, I think it's no surprise that there are a number of different literary forms that start to emerge. Again, they're questioning these ideas. One of the forms which really reignites is the form of philosophy. There have been great philosophical works in ancient Greece and in medieval Arabia and in India, but modern philosophy really begins at the start of the 17th century with the Frenchman René Descartes, who was famously said, "I think, therefore I am." And this was also the period that saw a boom in essay writing, diary writing, letter writing, and all these forms were kind of questioning the terms of the question itself. They were asking, what does it even mean to be human and to be here on this planet? And I think it's no surprise that at the same time, perhaps the greatest of the modern literary forms emerged, and that is the novel. The great novel started really at the beginning of the 17th century with a book which Dostoevsky said, he described this book as the ultimate and most sublime work of human thinking. And in 2002, a Nobel Prize panel said that this was the greatest book ever written. And I'm talking about Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, the Spanish writer. Now this, there were things that had been called novels which came before Don Quixote. But I think Don Quixote has a good claim to being the first great novel, because it's one of the first novels that really, it's a novel of questions. It's a novel that questions what we're doing on this planet and what even this novel is. It questions the nature of reality, the nature of writing, and the nature of reading. The story of Don Quixote, of course, the kind of central story, is of this slightly sort of befuddled upper middle class gentleman called Don Quixote, who is totally obsessed with reading tales of chivalry and knights and sort of fantastical tales of fighting giants and dragons. And he reads so many of these books that he becomes totally sort of convinced that he is living in one of these stories. And it's sort of unclear whether he's gone mad or if he's just got a very overactive imagination. But he recruits this simple farmer who lives nearby to be his noble squire. And he gets an old horse called Rocinante, who's broken down and just about good enough for pulling a cart, and says that this is his noble steed. And he gets onto Rocinante and brings Sancho Panza along on a donkey, and they go off on various adventures, one of which, the most famous of which, is when he sees some huge windmills on the horizon and thinks they're giants that he should be fighting, and so he runs off and fights these windmills and gets into a terrible scrape. But it's a very kind of, it's a very inventive novel, it's a very kind of postmodern novel in a way, because it's written in 2 books which were published 10 years apart. And in the second book, everyone's read the first book, so Don Quixote is now a famous character, so he's going around on these adventures and everyone's already read about him in the first one. So it's blending what's true and what's fictional, and it's brilliant, brilliant read. Then I think the next big sort of break in literature, the next big sort of step change, comes at the end of the 18th century with the French Revolution and the arrival of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, when suddenly a lot of work, a lot of agricultural work was being mechanized, and a lot of jobs that were previously done by humans were being done by machines. And this seems to have been the thing that prompted this great kind of Europe-wide movement known as Romanticism. Romanticism was this idea of, this kind of reaction to these machines, kind of waving the flag for the fact that there is something more to humans than just being able to be replaced by a machine. And so these romantic writers would look inside themselves, try and describe what was going inside themselves emotionally and spiritually. And also to look out to nature, because another fear of these great factories and the sort of start of urban pollution was that nature was being neglected and even spoiled. So you get these fantastic poets writing about nature and their inner workings. So when I was trying to think of an example to represent this shift, I thought one good example could have been the Lyrical Ballads, which was a poetry collection at the end of the 18th century, 1798, written by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which was in some ways a kind of manifesto for this movement. They saw it as a series of experiments in poetry, but really it became the founding text of this romantic movement, and includes a lot of their most famous poetry, like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Wordsworth's Tintin Abbey and so on. I could have chosen that. I could have chosen the great Russian poem Eugenie Onegin by Pushkin, which is in some ways the first great work of Russian literature, and again is a very sort of romantic poem. It's all about the inner turmoil of this tragic figure, Eugenie. But really, the text which kicks off the Romantic period in Europe is a text called The Sorrows of Young Werther by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Werther by Goethe. And this, in some ways, was the very first international bestseller. He wrote it when he was just 24, and it got a kind of cult following very, very quickly. It's the story of a young man who falls desperately in love with a girl who is engaged to someone else. And he goes through this terrible anguish, and he became the sort of poster boy for all tormented young lovers. Really, ever since, that's where we get that sort of stereotype from. And so I think I'd recommend The Sorrows of Young Werther. And the great thing about that is it's extremely short. So some of the books I've been describing are quite long. That's a very quick read. And then I thought I'd put another romantic book in, because the 19th century, lots of competing movements across it, and but Romanticism continues. It's just that it changes shape over the course of the 19th century, and as urbanization continues, factorization continues, Romanticism takes a darker turn, and there are several examples of kind of books in that tradition, but which take a really dark look at this idea of looking inside oneself, almost to the point of madness. And one I could have chosen, I very nearly did, was the great American novel, Moby Dick, by Herman Melville, possibly the best novel to have come out of the United States. But instead, I thought I'd champion a great novel from 1847, written in a tiny parsonage on the edge of the Yorkshire moors, by Emily Bronte. And I'm talking about Wuthering Heights, which is, I'm sure many of us have read it. If you haven't read it, it is mind-blowing. It is terrifying, hellish, nightmarish. It is really scary, and I recommend reading it. It kind of plumbs the depths of human psychological and physical cruelty of the fierceness of the passion between men and women, and how dangerous and potentially fatal that can be. And I just think it's extraordinary that this very shy daughter of a parson in a very remote part of England could produce this just stormer of a book. So I think that's a really good example of how Romanticism changed over the course of the 19th century, from this kind of idealistic project to look inside the self, to kind of looking almost too far and seeing the real depths of what humans are capable of. But as Romanticism was continuing through the 19th century, another movement sprung up known as realism. Realism, and sometimes social realism it's called. And this was a reaction, I think, to those works which were looking inside the identity. And it was an attempt to look out into the world, to describe the world outside, and also to make kind of sociological and political points about that world. So a great realist writer would be someone like Charles Dickens, who in a book like Bleak House tries to describe the status quo in London at the time, tries to describe how bad the poverty level is, how much contrast there is between the rich and the poor, and he's writing with a kind of polemical point there as well. So Bleak House I would recommend by Dickens. Really, I could have chosen any of Dickens' works there. So I could have, so this isn't one of my 10 recommendations, I could have recommended Bleak House. I could have recommended Madame Bovary, by Gustave Flaubert, which many consider one of the greatest French novels, and it's, again, he was one of the supreme French realists who really tried to describe exactly what he saw. He had this fantastic piece of, Flaubert had this fantastic piece of advice for Guy de Maupassant, another great French writer, where he said that what a writer should try to do is look at a whole line of taxi cabs. At the time, they would have been horse-drawn taxi cabs. And you should be able to describe that one taxi cab in such detail that I'd be able to pick it out from that line at a moment's glance. So, nice bit of advice there. But no, I'm not going to choose Madame Bovary. For realism, I'm going to choose that huge behemoth of a book, a Russian novel, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, which in a way, I feel like I'm slightly cheating by including War and Peace, because Tolstoy himself said that it wasn't a novel. He said it was so huge and so vast, and the scope of it was so big, he thought it was a tapestry or an epic rather than a novel. Because it covers, I think there are something like 580 named characters in War and Peace. And again, it covers every sort of echelon of society, from Napoleon, and set during the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century. Napoleon is a character in this, but so are, serfs and farmers, and they're all named and they have characters in it. So it's a huge, sprawling novel. But in many ways a kind of titan of the realist movement. Just two more to go, and then we've got questions. So out of realism, towards the end of the 19th century, there was another movement which was in a way a kind of refinement of realism. Because when you read a Dickens novel, although he's trying to evoke the real world that his readers would have known outside their doors and windows, but when you read him, it's not necessarily realistic. There's a difference, I think, but he's using the real world as an inspiration, but when you read a Dickens novel, it's almost like watching a play or something. These are very humorous characters, they're often larger than life characters, they often get into very funny or very awkward scrapes. And this new movement grew out of realism called naturalism. And naturalism was an attempt to describe things exactly as they are. So to almost transcribe life onto the page, and almost not to make a polemical point, just to show what was there and let the readers do the rest. And again, there are many writers towards the end of the 19th century who fit into this category. There's an American writer called Theodore Dreiser, who wrote Sister Carrie, which is a great American naturalist novel. There's a Danish novel called Niels Linne by Jens Peter Jacobsen, which is a great naturalist novel. The one I've sort of, when most people talk about naturalism, the figure who springs to mind is Emile Zola, who is really the sort of, the head of the naturalists. And again, really I could have chosen any of his novels to recommend here, but the one I'm going to recommend, number 9 on my list, is The Beast Within is how we translate it in Penguin Classics. In French it's La Bête Humaine, the human beast. And this is, it's really a kind of quite a grim, quite a tragic story about a character called Jacques Lantier, who is a steam engine driver. He drives a train, and he goes up and down this line. But inside him, he battles with these terrible urges, these violent urges. He's kind of desperately keeping this violence under control. And things take a turn for the worse when his friend, the station master, discovers that his wife has been cheating on him and tells Jacques Lantier about it, and things spiral out of control. But it's, I think it's one of those books where, because it's so accurate, it's so naturalistic, that it feels kind of, you feel like there's nothing that can stop it. It's just rolling on this terrible tragedy that you can sense coming. There's nothing that you can do to stop reading or to stop getting there. So that really takes us to the end of the 19th century, and this book covers all the classics from the Epic of Gilgamesh, from the start of literature up to the First World War. And perhaps we could talk in questions about where the term classic kind of stops. Of course, we have things we call modern classics, but for the purpose of this book, I've stopped in basically 1918. And so for my final book, and of course, I felt like I had to include him. How could I not when we're talking here in Kolkata? I thought for the final book I would recommend, I'm going to recommend The Home and the World by Rabindranath Tagore, of course. And I feel like this, for me, represents another great shift in literature after the end of the 19th century, before we enter the kind of world of modernism and postmodernism and all the different isms that we've had in the 20th century. I feel like there was a great moment when suddenly literature was opened up to more than an elite class of writers and readers, and suddenly there were people from and also from an elite class of Europeans as well. And suddenly there were people writing who wanted to make great change in the world. There were a number of political books written. And again, one I could have chosen as a British book called The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists by Robert Trussell, which is all about trade unions and industrial action, trying to change the position of the lower classes in Britain. But I think Tagore's Home and the World is a great example of this as well, which one book did such a lot to change opinions around the unrest in India and the entire British Empire at the start of the 20th century. So, that was quite a gallop through the whole of world literature, and it's a real pleasure to finish with Tagore here in his home city. And so, thank you. And I'd love to have some questions now. Thanks.
Sir, why you exclude Mahabharata?
Sorry, did you say it again?
Why you exclude Mahabharata in this list?
Marvel. Oh, Mahabharata. Gosh, well, as I said at the beginning, choosing 10 is pretty difficult. I chose the Ramayana. I could have chosen the Mahabharata. I mean, I haven't put the Odyssey in there. That feels pretty. That feels a shame. I mean, if you buy this book, you'll get 1,200, a list of 1,200. So it's in there. So, how would you like to do this?
We can take questions. I have a question. I have an observation to make that I'm glad you ended with The Home in the World, because it's a novel I teach to my students. And I think I'm using the Penguin World Classics edition.
Oh, fantastic.
So it's got a wonderful introduction. Thank you very much. That is a lovely, stimulating journey through the gems of world literature, as it were. I have a question before I open it up to the house. Many of my students tell me that the problem that they face with reading the classics is that the language can sometimes be daunting, terrifyingly obscure, and that the context is also a little difficult for them, especially the context of the Russian masters like Dostoevsky. They would react better to a Pride and Prejudice, which they often approach through the Kiera Nike movie, or So my question is: once we get over the mental block of the fact that language is moved in the modern, snappy, quick style, may be very different from the very figurative style of, say, the early 20th century masters like Joyce, or the 18th and 19th century. But there is a reward at the end of this this journey. So would you like to say something about how the classic is classified language?
Yes, I think you really put your finger on sort of why we read the classics, which is that I think it really frustrates me when people associate the word classic with kind of old, dusty, difficult books that we struggle through at school. And I think it's partly a problem with that term, classic, which is overused, and it's a kind of, it's a useful word in publishing to sort of market something as great work, but I think it's a double-edged sword because it does have its associations. And it frustrates me when people think of them like that, because actually the books which were dull and old-fashioned and dusty, that we've forgotten those books. There were loads of them and we don't read them anymore because they are dusty and old-fashioned. The point about classics and the reason they survive is that they weren't old-fashioned and of that time. They were doing something new, often radical, dangerous, fresh, and often controversial at the time. And so my feeling is that it is true that language can be difficult, it's true that the context can be difficult, but I think it's worth persisting through that, because that's the kind of wrapping paper around the heart of a book, which is, in a classic, something it's saying something new, it's saying something fresh, it contains some insight into what it means to be human and what the human experience consists of. And so if you can persist through that wrapping paper and unwrap it, as it were, a classic contains a great gift, which is to share that insight with the writer. But I do agree, it does take patience and sometimes practice, yeah.
Maybe I have some questions, yes.
You see, you haven't mentioned the name of Les Miserables. I don't know.
Les Miserables, yes.
I'm told this is one of the greatest books of.
It's true. I could definitely have included Les Miserables. And in fact, my partner and I are both currently reading Les Miserables. In fact, earlier today we were sitting side by side reading that book. I mean, you're right. It's perhaps the greatest book of the 19th century. I could have included it instead of War and Peace, but I already had a French one coming up with Zola, so I thought I'd shake it up. Yeah.
You talked about Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. Arguably, Leo Tolstoy was one of the giants of literature. My question to you is, Tolstoy was alive for 5 to 7 years after the Nobel Prize was instituted, but he didn't get the Nobel Prize. Was that 5 to 7 years?
Gosh, so
because he was already like a godlike figure at that point of time, but he didn't get the Nobel Prize.
It's a good question why Tolstoy. I mean, I'm no expert, but towards the end of Tolstoy's life, he slightly turned his back on his fame and his international recognition. He had an epiphany, in fact, and found religion very late in his life, and basically decided he wasn't happy with this international celebrity that he got, and he wrote a series of religious works. He wrote a sort of political book in order to fund a political group that he supported. And in fact, at the end of his life, he got so sick of his wealth and his wife and his family, he ran away at the age of 80 or something, and in fact died sort of on the run in a small provincial railway station. So I don't know is the answer, but I wonder whether that sort of shift in his personal views at the end of his life made him a slightly controversial figure, which maybe... Also, it's funny, when you look at the very start of the Nobel Prize, who they awarded it to, I think it took a little while for them to sort of get into their stride, and there's a few odd choices at the beginning, actually, and a lot of Scandinavian authors, for instance, when it, which is interesting given that it's based in Stockholm. So I don't have a definitive answer. I mean, wouldn't it have been great? Lots of people haven't won the prize who kind of should have in a way, and it's one of the problems with having to be alive to win it. Another one who springs to mind is Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer, who many people think should have won it and didn't. So, and then of course, recently when the sort of panel was revealed of who judges the Nobel Prize for Literature, it turns out to just be sort of 8 people who are friends, and actually suddenly the kind of mythical, mystic status of that prize has been devalued a little bit. So so my answer is I don't really know, but there might have been all sorts of factors which led into it.
Yes.
And you didn't include anyone from Southern America. 100 Years of Silence, for example.
Solitude.
Solitude, for example.
Good question. I think that's because I finished in 1918. I think if I'd gone on into the 20th century, Marquez would certainly have been in there, and Borges would have been too, actually. And the fact is that there were works of literature that appeared in 19th century Southern America, but most of them were almost in line with those of ancient epics. They tended to be nationalistic poems that were written with a specific purpose to kind of give these new nation states an identity and a common myth. And so I think we have to wait till really the sort of start of the 20th century for there to be these great works of Southern American literature. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Eliot. You introduced us to a lot of works which are important in the context of the history of literature. But let me ask you something very simple. What are the books you enjoy reading? Say the post-World War era books. For example, Kingsley Amis comes in England, and some of, as the gentleman mentioned, Marquez, Cien Años de Soledad, and various other books of Marquez. So you mentioned Borges as well. So some of the books that you enjoy reading, because in Penguin you have modern classics. My books by Anthony Burgess, Clockwork Orange. These books are marketed on the modern classics edition. So you mentioned Gilgamesh, which is dusty old book, which could be for some of us. But modern classics like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, and these books, which are marketed. When we buy it, we search on Amazon, they show it. It's modern classics. So it's great to have, shelf full of books which are classics and which are books which have turned out to be classics on hindsight after 20-30 years. So, and also the fact that the Nobel Prize was mentioned, some of the greatest authors who have changed the shape of literature have never won. Joyce never won Nobel Prize. Virginia Woolf, she never won Nobel Prize. Mainly because she committed suicide. So Nobel Committee thought that she wasn't good enough.
So she was dead. So she was, yeah.
She committed. So some books you enjoy reading after the post-World War era.
Okay, gosh, well, thank you very much for that. Lots to discuss there. So, you're absolutely right. What I haven't really talked about at all is the period that's covered by modern classics. And just to say a word about that, in my view, so modern classics is a slightly, almost tautological term, for something to be modern and a classic. My view of modern classics is that it's almost like a kind of holding pen or quarantine period for books which we think may be the classics of the future, but simply not enough time has passed to tell if they are indeed timeless. We know they're of great literary quality, and they speak to the moment, but only time will tell if they speak for all time. And I sort of hope, my kind of touch wood, I don't know if it will happen, but I hope there'll be a second volume to this book which will cover the last 100 years and cover many of the titles that you've been talking about. But in terms of my favourite books from the post-First World War period, well, to name a couple, I'd say, George Orwell is an absolutely extraordinary writer. I'd pick 1984 of his works. Not so well known, but someone I absolutely love is the writer Mervyn Peake, who wrote the Gormenghast trilogy, Titus Groan, Gormenghast, and Titus Alone. They're wonderful works of fantasy, really. They're great imaginative works, but set in a kind of medieval style castle. Totally extraordinary and great kind of, they're really about what it means to grow up and be ambitious and not be ambitious and your family relationships and so on. And the third example, maybe let's go to something that isn't British. Well, I guess I'd have to say Borges again, who is just a great love of mine. And we were in Argentina earlier this year and went to see the library where he worked and made a little sort of pilgrimage to various spots that were related to him. So if people don't know Borges, he wrote these very, very short, almost sort of micro-fiction stories around really kind of mind-bending philosophical ideas.
It's a famous story. I read it and it went over my head. The Circular Ruins.
Circular Ruins is fantastic. And my favourite one is The Garden of Forking Paths, which is extraordinary. Great, thank you for that. Yeah.
Was it necessary to write
No, I don't think it was necessary, because there are lots of very kind of light books which came out at about the time that Emile Zola was writing. I mean, one that springs to mind is Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome, which is one of the funniest books ever written about the same time. Yeah, they are very dark, aren't they? You know, especially his first successful novel, Thérèse Raquin, which is about a couple, a man and woman who murdered a woman's husband. But the paralysed mother of the murdered man is still alive, and all she can move is her eyes, and she just sort of, she's in the house with them watching what they do. So it's a pretty bleak idea for a book. It sounds like you know more than me. I don't know if it comes from the Darwinian theories coming out of that time, but sorry, well maybe it's coincidence, I don't know. I suspect it just has more to do with Zola's personality and what he felt like he wanted to write. Because I think other books from that period are not necessarily dark, but it's a good observation. Thank you. Yeah.
You mentioned some of the classics were translated. So do you feel that if a work is translated, the value of the work is diminishes by some extent?
Right.
I picked down a Harry Potter book which was translated in Bengali, and I could not catch that much. So similarly, I feel like people who will read Home and the World in English, they can never really get that taste of Tagore which we got by reading Bengali.
Yeah, just one of the experiences I have had as a professor of English is that sometimes translations can actually enhance one's understanding. For example, I teach Plautus, who was a Roman writer, a playwright, and I don't think any of the 2000 born young men and women I teach would have approached Plautus or Sophocles had it not been for some very beautiful translations which came through the Penguin World Classics edition. And,
well, I think it's a really key question. This is something we have to think about all the time. And it's interesting to remember that when Penguin Classics as a series began, it was purely a translation series. There were no English language titles in it for the first 40 years. So it was all translations from other literatures. And I think in one way, you're absolutely right. I don't think you'll ever get exactly the same experience as reading a work in its original language. But I think, Monabi, your point is exactly right, that the trouble is we don't all speak 30, 40 different languages. And so I guess the problem of Penguin Classics is to try to bring those great works of literature to readers in as close a way as it can. And it's interesting that the founding editor of Penguin Classics had very strong views on translation. And he felt like the absolute principle that you had to stick to was the principle of equivalent effect. So he actually valued sort of literal accuracy lower than that. He wanted his translations to produce the equivalent effect on the reader that you would get if you read it in the original, even if that meant making some changes to the sort of style or whatever, rather than being totally literal. So I do agree with you. I think it will never be the same. But for those of us, for instance, who don't speak Bengali, it's a great privilege to be able to at least get close to it with the translation. And I think that really is the project of Penguin Classics.
any more questions? Yes, later.
In translation, right? In the written words, alliteration, similes, and metaphors, they play a very important part. They raise prose to the level of poetry. In a translation, how do you catch these three, metaphor, simile, and alliteration, in different language?
Well, it's very hard, and it means that the skill of a translator is a really great skill when they're good, because they're not only having to stick to their model, they're also having to produce a great work of literature in their own right. And there are some, stories of these just absolute feats of translation. Like it makes me think of, do you know that French novel by Georges Perec called? It's called La Disparition, the disappearance. And it's a crime novel about someone called Anton Vaul, who has disappeared. and you're not quite sure who he is and what has disappeared, and then you start to realise that the thing that has disappeared is the letter E. And Georges Perec wrote this entire novel, 300-page novel, without using the letter E once. I mean, it's mind-bogglingly difficult in French. Even harder in English when the word the has the letter E. At least in French you can use words which have la. But this translator called Gilbert Adair did it. He somehow he called it a void rather than the disappearance, because I don't know how to use it. And he somehow managed to translate it. I think it's just you just need to have very good translators. It's a real art, a skill, and it's kind of, you've got to do two jobs. You've got to write the book that was written before, and you've got to write a great new work of literature.
Is there time for one question?
Got 2 minutes.
So the other thing is that you didn't mention about Hamlet, but have you taken Shakespeare for granted in the sense he wrote about 39 plays and keeping England's national poet? You didn't include any.
True. I know, I felt a bit guilty not including Shakespeare. Shakespeare is the master, and I think he is, I just find him spectacular, the way that he manages to encapsulate such a huge scope of reference and a vision of the world, but then also the minutest observation of how humans interact and what they're like. He is extraordinary. And also I think what's so exciting about Shakespeare is that period, that Elizabethan London period, which was so fruitful in terms of literature, language was also fluid. So he was using language in such a playful way, using a word often with sort of 3 or 4 nuances of meaning to kind of produce these effects which, really benefit from returning again and again to these words. And in a way, no one will be able to do that again, because language has now become so sort of there are such kind of pedants when it comes to language now since the 19th century, when we dictionary projects and encyclopedia projects. It's very hard to be as kind of fluid and playful with language. So no, you're absolutely right. I don't mean to take it for granted that I love it. It's just it's quite difficult choosing 10.
Thank you, Eliot. That was a very beautiful voyage through the world of Penguin Classics, and I'm sure you'll all be running to the nearest bookstore. I wish so to get this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.